Are we set? I think we're set. Great.
Ready to roll? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, just a quick introduction for anyone that hasn't been here before. Father Jeffrey Langen, PhD, is a priest in the Prelature of Opus Dei and serves as senior fellow at the Principium Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Before his ordination, he was an associate professor and chair of the Department of Liberal Studies at Holy Cross College at the University of Notre Dame. He holds PhDs in philosophy from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross and in government from the University of Notre Dame, along with degrees in classics from Columbia University and history from Marquette University. Father Langen has authored several books, including The French Revolution Confronts Pius VI, The End of Conservatism, and From Animal House to the Academy, and co-edited Ethics Without God. His academic contributions include numerous articles and presentations at international conferences in Europe and the Americas. Tonight we will be discussing what is part 2 of our last discussion, which dipped our toes in the phenomenon of public intellectuals and or influencers such as Nick Fuentes, Jared Taylor, Andrew Anglin, and the like. As our last discussion unfolded, towards the end we got closer to the philosophical and Catholic understanding of accidental properties, which Father Langen is going to expand upon tonight. Let's please give our attention to Father Jeff as he takes the floor.
Okay.
We'll have time for questions and discussion as a group this evening as well. Thanks so much for being here, gentlemen, and you can take it away, Father Jeff.
And then also, just so everybody knows, it's being recorded. Just so we all know. Well, we know it's being recorded, and we know how it's being recorded. It's probably also being recorded in other ways, but but we're officially recording it. So, just a few things. Again, the idea of this is that it's a discussion, and the previous discussion, the setup of the previous discussion was just several of the fathers were aware that their sons, especially at school, were starting to listen to Nick Fuentes, especially after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. There was one commentator said, Nick Fuentes is going to be one of those who fills the vacuum of Charlie Kirk for young men. So I thought, well, a friend of mine has had dealings with Nick Fuentes going back to 3 or 4 years at least. I myself was aware of him from when I was living in Boston, when he left Boston University to start his whole operation, which this now would have been 6 or 7 years ago when he kind of got himself going. So I thought, well, again, I know a lot of the defects of people who do daily news shows or daily broadcasts. There's both strengths and weaknesses. And I know also from some people that I know that had dealings with him, that while people who do these daily broadcasts, and to do any of these broadcasts for over any significant amount of time and have it survive, you have to have some intelligence, right? I'm not denying that. But there's always going to be gaps, because a daily broadcaster doesn't have the time to, oftentimes, there's a simple thing of time, doesn't have the time to go deeper, especially philosophically deeper, into what are the principles that should be guiding the discussion. And that's where I thought, and actually, another kind of prefatory point. About a month ago, I got a call from a fellow member of Opus Dei who does a lot of traveling to the different centers of Opus Dei around the country. And he called me. One of the topics that came up in our conversation is, he said, well, almost every center I go to where they have activities with high school boys, I get the question from one of the leaders or from someone who's helping to organize things, what do we do about Nick Fuentes, right? Because the boys are listening to Nick Fuentes. And actually, this guy and I, we kind of were I think actually this fellow is a Northridge grad. But anyway, we were kind of in agreement in the conversation that when you're dealing with someone like Nick Fuentes, you're not dealing with, it's like a great occasion. It's a great occasion for just teaching people how to think. And so I think one of the reasons for this is just to go through, almost as a little bit, just to go through what are the resources we have And how would you like start to think some of these problems through? Ultimately, what the church, I think, is what the church helps us to do and what the church wants us to do, especially in our day and age, is get to the principles, understand what the principles are. And if we understand what the principles are, well, then we can start to apply those principles into circumstances with the ideas that people are coming up with as we learn them, because things are always changing. So in the last discussion, one of the issues that comes up, especially with Nick Fuentes and people that kind of surrounding him, and I've been aware of this problem, or this development, you might say, for, well, in different ways it enters into American discourse ever since the Civil Rights Movement, maybe even beforehand. Well, way beforehand even, because the origin of a lot of the racial theories of the 20th century was precisely in the ideas of Madison Grant going back to the 1920s. But last time we were discussing, white nationalism. Can you, what is white identity? What is it from a substantive standpoint? Understanding what is human nature, and then understanding, well, what do people mean when they say white? And one of the questions, I think, one of the questions that we were driving at last time, one of the questions we were driving at last time is, what is human nature? And once you understand human nature, what does that tell you about, well, when someone says I'm white, what does that mean, actually? And we got a little bit derailed because I was explaining, to really understand this, to really understand human nature, you have to understand some basic concepts. And those basic concepts are form and matter, act and potency, substance and accidents. And so last time we got derailed from that. Also, last time, as I was thinking about our last discussion, it also struck me that you have to understand some important concepts in political philosophy. So, for example, what is a nation? What is a state? What is a people? That these are important concepts for explaining reality. And because so often, like for example, once you say nation, or once you say I'm a nationalist, right? You'll see people turn white in fear, and they say, well, next thing you know, you're going to put your arm up, and you're going to start giving us these signs, right? So there are some of these terms. You have to understand the principles, because also you have to be able to defend the genuine reality. I think a lot of times people like Nick Fuentes, when they come up with these terms like white nationalism, or now there are even groups that are speaking along these lines, they're basically reacting against something that's an excess on one direction, and they're identifying something that's true and actually you need to account for, but then they're going to another extreme. And so the church wants us to go to principles so that we can understand what are the principles we're trying to implement in our circumstances. So then I was thinking through this problem, and I thought, well, what's the best way to do this? And I thought of several books that I helped a friend of mine to write, Dr. Jones. And what did we do when we were writing those books? We did two things. We tried to find some systematic treatment of whatever was the topic we were trying to deal with that was done by some Catholic predecessor. And then once we got to that systematic treatment, the next thing we would do is, okay, well, how do you put that in contemporary circumstances? Oftentimes the systematic treatments, they're an articulation of the principles, but without any context, right? Not in any circumstances. And that's the challenge. How do you bring these two together? And so the first kind of show and tell item here, so those are the readings we sent around for this time. So the first set of readings, and just to explain this a little bit, about 10 years ago, a former student of mine who was a graduate student, and he was writing his dissertation at a university about 2 hours from here. And he told his advisor, you know, these Catholic manuals in philosophy and theology that were written in like the 1940s and the 1950s, they're the best, some of the best stuff out there is in these manuals. It's clear, there's principles, you can see the arguments, and this is what people need, right? There's real value. There's real value for these things. And his advisor, she shut the door. And she's a well-known, I think she's retired now, but she was well-known and respected in Thomistic circles. But anyway, she shut the door. And she said to him, in a hushed voice, what you're saying is true, right? But you can't say that in public, right? Not now, not before you get tenure. But maybe once you get tenure, you could try to kind of explain this once again. And so anyway, then she opened the door and they talked about baking cake and fried chicken and things like that. So, and you could also say there is I think it's important just to say something historically. And then one of the readings I gave you was from this manual by a guy named Grenier. And by the way, you can find all these 3 volumes, you can find them, there's PDFs online of all 3 volumes. This is like a classic Thomistic manual of philosophy, all the subfields of philosophy. And how did this come about? Right? I think the whole point is, how did this come about? How did it get destroyed? But why is it still a good thing? That would be the question here. Well, again, I think in the United States, in 1920, right around the year 1920 or so, most of the leadership of what we would call Catholic universities, they made the decision and the commitment. They basically said, well, back in the late 19th century, back in the 1880s, the Pope encouraged the whole church to relearn St. Thomas Aquinas, the principles of St. Thomas Aquinas. Because the Pope realized that for 2 or 3 centuries, Catholic leaders were just embracing whatever was the intellectual current of the day. And they with no critical lens. They were just saying, well, whatever's going on in the 1760s, that's awesome. We're going to embrace it and just be Catholic and not worry too much about how to reconcile all these things. So by the time you get to the 1880s, Pope Leo XIII, he writes an encyclical and he says, what we should do, rather than just embracing these philosophies as they come out, the systems of men, he said, we should first learn the right approach to philosophy, the approach of St. Thomas Aquinas, which will give us the principles that we need for evaluating intellectual currents and scientific currents as they arise. And we can then better evaluate what's good, what's bad, what should be kept, what can be developed. And also, I mean, obviously, whenever you're critiquing something, you also grow in the understanding of the truth that you accept. So after 40 or 50 years of debate, finally the leadership in America, the Catholic leadership in America said, what we should do is we should start teaching the approach of St. Thomas Aquinas in all of our universities. And then people said, well, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to write some sort of a textbook so that they can get the principles, because you can't read everything Aquinas wrote. It takes up 12 shelves on the library. We can't teach that to a college student. Well, let's make a manual right? That someone came up with the idea. Let's make these manuals, which are kind of a synthesis of the basic arguments and the basic principles. And then, with these manuals, then the teacher in the classroom, he or she will have the principles that they can then use for teaching the students. And then, so for example, my dad goes to the University of Detroit in the 1950s. What was the core curriculum at the University of Detroit in the 1950s? 8 philosophy classes. And in those 8 philosophy classes, they basically learned these 3 volumes of philosophy, all the different subfields of philosophy. That was the core curriculum. And the hope was that someone like my dad, who was a business major, right, the hope was that he would learn these principles, he would be a business major, and then he and his life would fuse them together in how he acted, turning the swamps of the suburbs of Detroit into suburbs of Detroit where people could live, so they didn't just live in the swamp. So in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, there was what I would consider to be almost a violent reaction against the manual tradition, the manuals that were developed from the 1920s to the 1950s. Why? They were too simplistic. They didn't meet all the arguments. They didn't apply to all the circumstances. The world was developing the new science based on the Kinsey report from the 1950s, which we can go into later if you want to. Right? There was this sense that was cultivated, like these manuals aren't good enough, and in many places they were just thrown out. In fact, it wouldn't even surprise, like just for example, this copy. If you look, this copy. Sometimes you look in these manuals and you look at the front of the back that we have in many of our houses. I don't see it here. But a lot of times you get these old manuals that are in like the library of a place like Midtown. And you look around a little bit and you realize, oh, this is an old, I'm just making up a name now, right? This was from the College of St. Josephina or something like that. The College of St. Polycarpus. And it's just a manual that they threw out at some point because they realized, well, we gotta get up to date. So, but again, I think and the reason I sent around, last time we were discussing nationalism. What is a people? What is a nation? What is a state? White nationalism. Well, in volume 3, part 2, which I sent around the 15 pages for anybody that wants to read it, there's like a beautiful just 3-page treatment of what is a state, what is a nation, what is a people, what are the responsibilities of government. And now again, it's just one discussion. But again, what's one of the defects of that is that, well, you got to apply it to the circumstances. And so that's why I also sent around this, and I thought it was interesting. Last time we agreed over the summertime to read and discuss this article about Nick Fuentes. And right before we had the discussion last time, Nick Fuentes was in the news again. So it was like the perfect setup for what we wanted to do. And so this time, once again, last week, Davos met. They were meeting in Davos. This is the meeting of the oligarchs of the world every year for the last 40 or 50 years in Davos, Switzerland. And it's basically where the oligarchs go to make their plans for us, right? Which is what oligarchs have always done, right? They always have these meetings where they make their plans for the future, like how they're gonna influence legislatures and how they're gonna influence people and whatnot. So one of the speakers at Davos was Mark Carney. I think he's the Prime Minister of Canada. And he gave this speech about the international order. And he said something that's, before I tell you what he said, I need to say one other thing as part of maybe just who I am. right? When I entered graduate school in political science in the 1990s. And so before I was a priest, I was a professor for 12 years, as Seamus said, in political science, political philosophy, political economy in the university about 2 hours from here. And in the 1990s, when I was in graduate school, the big discussion was the international rules-based order, right? And how the international rules-based order was just. It was the culmination of Western civilization, where people could pursue justice and the common good and promote real development throughout the world. And another debate that I oftentimes raised in the 90s when I was a graduate student was, and I did because I did research into it on my own, some of the people that were there at the founding of the UN, let's say after the Second World War, they didn't really believe in justice or the common good. Right? They were more, well, they were materialists and Marxists, basically. And so, and then there were others that mostly came out of the British tradition, the Anglo-American tradition. They also didn't believe in justice and the common good. In fact, they didn't really want there to be a UN to begin with. Or if there was a UN, they just wanted to use it as an instrument for advancing their power. Because they weren't materialists or Marxists, but they were saying, look, the Anglo-American system is the superior system in the world. It's the most powerful system in the world. We have to continue to make things that way, by hook or by crook. And justice is not a consideration here. If we can use the UN to our advantage, all the better. If not, we just discard it and we do something else. And I think the Vatican has a special role here, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But the mantra that was always used in the 90s was the rules-based international order. And when we were discussing Nick Fuentes and nationalism or white nationalism a few months ago, some of the critics of Nick Fuentes a few months ago would say things like, well, you have to reject white nationalism because it goes against the rules-based international order. So that's the context of Mark Carney's speech. And just one other point. There's been, in the last 30 years, there's been many people in the international system who have basically said, if you look at the behavior of England and France and the United States, what you see is not a rules-based international order based on justice or rights or anything like that. You just see this self-interested power group acting in its own interests. And the retort to that always was, no, we're promoting democracy, we're promoting justice, we're promoting something else, something. So Mark Carney, when he goes to Davos, and Davos, by the way, there's all these little prefatory points, but I think they're helpful for the discussion. Davos was started by Klaus Schwab because he wanted to have an institution that, especially Western leaders who were promoting the rules-based international order, could come and talk about how to shore up the rules-based international order. So when Mark Carney goes to Davos, he's going to one of the central nodes of cultural, political discussion for this rules-based international order that's opposed to nationalism and wants to color nationalism as an evil thing. So Mark Carney says, for decades, Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, benefited from its predictability. We pursued values-based foreign policies under its protection. And then this is the thing where he pulls the curtain, like in the scene of The Wizard of Oz where they pull the curtain. Right? So in the next sentence here, it's incredible. I mean, when he said this, for me as a student, you might say an observer of politics for the last 30 years or so, 40 years, it was like this was an incredible moment. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. The fiction was useful. It helped provide for public goods, sea lanes, financial system, security, a framework for resolving disputes. We participated in the, I'm skipping a few things here, but just I want to get to some of the essential ideas. We participated in the rituals. We avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. And then he says, well, now we're in a time of rupture. The concept of the rules-based order, a lie in itself, was useful for proxy forces, the vassals of the global hegemon. But then he says, but now the hegemon has turned on the vassals who supported it. Carney is calling Canada and the United States, I mean, just to interpret this, right? If it needs interpretation, he's saying basically Canada, England, France, Germany, Italy, they're vassals of the American empire. They're kind of colonies of the American empire. But now the empire is turning on its vassals. Economic policy is now being used as a weapon. Financial infrastructure as coercion. You cannot live this lie through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. And so he basically announces then by the end of his talk that we're leaving this. We realize now we're on our own. We're going to have to make our own deals with countries. So this I think, and then in the little article that I sent out, we go to Paradise Lost because because Donald Trump a few weeks ago was asked in an interview, what is the source of morality in the decisions that you make? And Trump said, my mind. My mind is the source of morality. And for those who were here last June here at Midtown, precisely that's what we were discussing. That one of the fundamental foundational points of America, of American individualism, is that first speech of Satan in Paradise Lost, where Satan says, the mind let me get to the quote here. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. And then he says, well, at least here in hell, we will reign secure. To reign in hell is worth the ambition. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. That's the one of the essential points of the first speech of Satan. There's a book that came out last year. I don't recall now the title of it, but this author in England, he wrote a book about how influential this speech of Satan has been, and it's just an Englishman he has no, he's not religious in any sense. He's not saying it for any significant religious reasons, but he says this speech of Satan, right, is quoted. He goes through the history of American literature, and also American political history, and he quotes all of the great pieces of American literature and political commentary that use the speech of Satan from Paradise Lost as an important theoretical, as an important part of the thesis. For example, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which was the most read book during the time of the American Revolution, or Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous speech, Self-Reliance, which is one of the, again, a fundamental piece of American individualism. And this guy goes all the way down to authors like Malcolm X, how Malcolm X quoted the speech of Satan. So, so Donald Trump's expression, my mind is the source of morality, we're not saying that he's a John Milton scholar, right? We're not saying that he read John Milton even. Maybe he did in high school. But it's interesting that idea, it's so much part of how we think about who we are, that it can enter into the mind of a politician, to where he just articulates it as if, well, that's a normal thing, right? That's just a normal thing. And so I think what we see happening was, and the bigger question now for the entire discussion is this order that was set up after the Second World War of the United Nations, right? The international order that's set up after the Second World War. Is it just an order that is based on the interests of nations, the interests of a few nations against the rest of the world? Is it capable of being rooted in a genuine understanding of law, of human rights, of human nature, and also of the place of nations within that order, like a genuine place of nations within that order? And so I think that we have like all the pieces here for a healthy understanding of both the harmony that we're striving for in the political order, and also a way of critiquing, on the one hand, an excess like white nationalism as promoted by Nick Fuentes and people like him, and on the other hand, the erroneous understandings of the international order, either the chaotic ones or the international order in the interests of some progressive oligarchic elite. So there's a lot more I could say. I want to stop here and just open it up for discussion or questions or comments. And one thing also I failed to send around, which I could also discuss, is just a definition of all the terms we're using. In part, that was part of the reading that we did send around, but I also prepared a definition of act, potency, form and matter, accidents and substance. If that were to be helpful, we can use that. And anyway, the questions, comments?
Nick Fuentes, I don't know, but I read a little bit in the article. But I follow politics a little bit.
Yeah.
And I've heard the Davos thing, and it's interesting
Yeah.
to see that coming through. But Nick Fuentes, I just need a little background.
Yeah, so Nick Fuentes is he as an 18-year-old, he went to Boston University. He grew up in Park Ridge, went to a public school there, and
LaGrange Park.
Yeah.
Park.
oh, LaGrange, sorry.
Same thing.
Yeah. Well, a suburb of Chicago. And then ended up going to, and I don't think as a 18-year-old he was probably at best he's a Sunday Catholic, let's put it that way. But in a public school, through the public school system. So it's not like he got the formation of a student at Northridge, for better or for worse, right? And so when he was 18, which is when I came across him, he was at Boston University. He thought, well, this place is crazy. and he started his own radio show, like an internet radio show, geared towards 18-year-old men. And so a lot of his radio show from that point to the present day has been a criticism of different elements of progressive liberal culture that he finds repulsive. So DEI, the transvestite movement, the trans movement, the LGBTQ, blah, 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 whatever it is. And then but he gets very much involved in also commenting in conservative politics. And he also has his critiques that he'll give of various elements within the conservative movement. And so, but again, like I was saying, in the last year or so, maybe even longer, he'll oftentimes start to take positions in which he defends white nationalism as that's the solution to our problems. We have to identify our white culture and defend it against all of the. That's one position that he'll adopt.
Is that good?
Well, I think the idea is that there's a problem with that, right? There's a problem with that. That's the whole point of this discussion we had last fall, is that we're not fun. Part of I think the last fall's discussion, the whole point of it was that whiteness is, yes, we all possess this accidental property of the color of our skin, right? But it's an accidental property. It doesn't define us. The substance of our human nature is that we have souls, right? The soul is what makes us human. And the soul has powers. The soul and the powers of the soul can be actualized in different ways, in different cultures over time. But that's not, even as you're speaking on those levels, the whole part of the last discussion also was, what's the origin of the term white versus black, right? It's a creation of the mind, not a creation of reality. The whole distinction between white and black was first made in Virginia, back in the 16th century. There were two kinds of slaves on the plantation. There were the Irish slaves, and there were the African slaves. And they were starting to kind of get together, and they were conspiring in a way, because they realized, we're not in a just situation here. There's something wrong with how we're being treated. And they started to act in common against the plantation owners. And so the plantation owners started to say, well, we got to separate these people into different groups. What was the category that they used to separate them into different groups? You guys are the whites, you guys are the blacks. So the whole creation of the distinction between white and black was a category of the mind, based on also wanting to divide these two groups so they couldn't act together to pursue justice. So in a way, it's a false category. Now, it's used all the time now, and there's all sorts of ways in our history that these false categories have been applied, or that they've been weaponized to, I would argue, to our detriment. And if I ever got in front of Nick Fuentes, I would try to explain this to him. Because I think it takes some, again, I think it takes some research and some understanding to get into, well, you do got to explain at some point, well, how did we get from Virginia in 1564 to the Civil Rights Movement to where we are today? I would even argue that by the time you got to 2007, 2008, there was a lot more harmony between the races than now. That there was a reintroduction of, there were efforts by someone to reintroduce a vitriolic component from 2008 to 2016 or so, and beyond. Question, comment?
Yeah, so Nick Fuentes is obviously very popular amongst our age group.
Yes.
And I've listened to him. And I guess my question based off what you brought up with like white nationalism, and what he says a lot is, or yes, his issue that he brings up is the mixture or introduction of all these different cultures in America is helping to like kind of disintegrate
Yeah,
the
that's the purpose of those who have done
society
it.
and
Yeah,
the culture, because he always brings up, you know, America should be based on white
Right.
culture and like, you know, going to baseball games
Yep.
with your
Yep.
family and whatnot. And so he's really pushing hard to like talk about how
Yeah, so-
all these,
yeah,
the
so-
mixture of culture is bad.
Right. So that's where, again, that's where I think some principled discussion, making some distinctions is necessary. Where white culture, I think it's a term that's, for some reason, it's being introduced. And I think the term itself is introduced to be, so it can be weaponized against those who use the term. Right? But that's where I think some distinctions need to be made. And so, for example, immigration has been, in my own study of the matter, you can go back to the 1930s to find the beginning of weaponized migration. Right? There was a professor at the University of Chicago, Louis Wirth, and he along with John Dewey, it's probably a name you remember from somewhere in your education, Dewey, the great John Dewey.
Library.
Well, no, different.
Different one.
Dewey, different one. John Dewey was the creator of the American public educational system. But he was a professor at Chicago at the time. But anyway, Louis Wirth, John Dewey, and some others, their concern in the 1930s were the growth of Italian, German, Irish, Polish neighborhoods in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York City, Baltimore, Cleveland. And their concern was, these people are going to destroy America. Well, how can we, and their concern was, how can we break up their neighborhoods? Right, so they introduced a system for using weaponized migration, going to the South, finding poor families that had just got out of slavery, and then putting them into these ethnic neighborhoods as basically a way as breaking up those neighborhoods to make the people move to the suburbs where they would be more docile to radio, to the messages that were being given to them by radio, television, magazines, movies in the 1930s and 40s. So migration has been weaponized in this country at least since the 1930s. So I would grant, using the language of philosophy, I would grant that premise, right? And I could point you to books and research, and I myself have done research that shows how this took place.
That was an actual OSS operation.
Yeah.
That was discussed in
Yeah.
Slaughter Cities.
Right, right. That's
Dr.
the research that I could point you to.
Yeah, it was a good book.
So, I would grant that premise. I would say on the other hand, there is a and this is where I would also grant, there is a natural, when you look at immigration in history, especially in American history, there is and even St. Thomas Aquinas identifies this at some point. The natural progression for immigration is 3 generations. Right? And so what happened in American history is that in the first generation, I mean, where are we? We're in a neighborhood that is, why is it called Bucktown? Well, originally it was the Irish Catholic neighborhood. But then by the 1890s, the Irish Catholics moved to other neighborhoods in Chicago. And so they they put the Poles into this neighborhood. And that's why there's like, I think within a mile of us, there's 5 Polish churches, 5 old Polish churches. Because from 1890 until the 1980s, this was a Polish neighborhood, or 1970s, this was a Polish neighborhood. And the natural progression in the United States is first generation that you're here, you're living in your ethnic neighborhood. Second generation, people from your ethnic group marry someone from another ethnic neighborhood. So the Poles marry the Irish. That's my mom and dad, right? And then the third generation, you just consider yourself a Catholic American. And maybe you still eat pierogies and you have corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's feast day, but you know, I mean, it's not this, but basically you're living with everybody else at this point. I mean, but what's interesting is that your primary identification, there's kind of a little bit of a transformation that takes place where your primary identification goes from being an ethnic Catholic, I'm an Irish Catholic, to I'm a Catholic American and I have Irish elements within me, but really I'm an American. Just a little silly, like this is like a small detail, but I think it says a lot. I forget who it is now. But it was some Italian. I was reading this account of some Italian who's more well known, but now I'm blanking on his name. But he went back, when he went back to, he was from Italy and grew up in this country. But when he finally went back to Italy, he realized, I'm an American. I'm no longer really an Italian. Why? I walk like an American. And all the Italians, when they're walking around, they walk differently, they're closer together, they walk slower, right? I walk like an American. And so I think the point, and this is also what the book, this is also why the principled approach I think is very helpful. The principled approach says, what makes up your nation? It's your language, it's your religion, it's certain customs that you have. Custom is unwritten law. And it's also certain things that are determined by your geography, like where you live. Most Italians that live in Chicago are used to the cold. Most Italians that live in Sicily are not, right? But I mean, it's very simplistic, but at the same time, that there's something about that, right? So the point that I would grant is that yes, we do possess a culture which is uniquely American, but it's not white culture. It's something else. I would say it would be better to say it's American culture. And then I think the concern is that when you say it's white culture, you're making it easy for the current mechanisms of weaponization against you in the culture. Right? So there's a better way to describe and defend your identity than to just use this label, well, I'm a white nationalist. So in other words, I would grant several parts of that argument, but I would say I think the distinction, and also to understand what when you say this is my nationality, right? The elements of nationality, which are language, religion, customs, geography, maybe even education, right? Those are much more closer to your identity than using the label whiteness. So I would agree with you, and I think this even came up a little bit in the last time we were here. Tom isn't here right now, but Tom was taking the position of, but when we started to talk about his position, he kept coming to, there are these elements of our culture which we need to defend. And the response is, well, yeah, I agree. We want to defend these elements of our culture, but better to do it as this is American culture, not a racial category.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Do you think he's doing it to be? I've watched a little bit of Fuentes, but I've seen recently he's come out and done a lot of mainstream interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. In the last several months.
That's where I've mostly kind of seen him.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me that he's mostly calling it white culture to be provocative.
Right.
I think feels like a lot of his views are really to, shift the Overton window, if you will, just to go as far as you can over here to just bring everyone back to the center. So, I don't know. I don't take anything he says too seriously, I guess, or too.
Yeah.
Maybe that's right or wrong.
Well, no, I think the point of bringing him up is not that he's like the next great intellectual, but I think the reason for bringing it up is that he's seizing on something that a lot of people sense, and he's one of the few that's trying to articulate it. And I think it's worth trying to understand, well, what is it that he's trying to articulate? Even though he might not be giving the best expression to it. Why? Because, like when I before I was here in Chicago, I was a chaplain at Harvard for a while, and then, again, I was a graduate student, and I was a professor at Notre Dame. And I've seen over time how just using the expression white, it's weaponized. It's weaponized to be used against those people that you give that label. Right? There's also, like, it's one of these terms that it's almost better not to ascribe it to yourself.
But is there a distinction between, there's the physical aspect that I am white. Is that fair to say?
You have the phenotype. I mean, it's undeniable.
Is there?
Yeah, that's your phenotype.
Is there a distinction between, like, IQ? Is that something that can be talked about? Like,
well,
and can I ask the question?
You can.
The U.S. is becoming less and less white.
Right, but again, I would say,
a good or a bad thing?
I would say, look, if you're going to talk about IQ, a lot of times IQ is based on a number of things that are not your phenotype. Mm-hmm. This is where, like, the understanding of act and potency. We all have souls. Our souls have certain powers. I mean, maybe not even act and potency. We all have brains. Our brains can activate. We don't even know yet how much of our brains we're using from a scientific standpoint. I think what we do know is that with the development of culture, IQ goes up. A lot of IQ is pattern recognition. And so if you have certain languages, if you learn mathematics, in other words, going back to what I just said, what makes up nationality? Custom, education, language, religion. Right? Hungarians have super high IQs. Why? Because their language is impossible to understand. But they all understand it. They start speaking it when they're 2. So I would say, again, it's not your phenotype white that gives you your high IQ. It's your nationality. It's the culture that you're in, the customs, the language. It's a combination of factors. The educational system, right? So but the point would just be that also we all have, if you understand act and potency as human beings with souls, and our souls have an intellect and a will, right? We all have this capacity that could be developed. It's there and it can be developed. The question is, is it part of your national culture? It is a legitimate question. Is it part of your national culture? The practices, the religion, the education. Part of education is within your culture. Are there cultural mechanisms for controlling your passions, so that the intellect can reign in the soul, right? If you can control your passions and the intellect can reign in your soul, your IQ is going to go up. And then we know this in athletics, right? There can also be individuals that have, for whatever reason, God gives them gifts. God doesn't distribute all the gifts equally between persons and cultures over time. But if you're in a culture that's never had been civilized, I would imagine you're going to have lower IQs.
Right.
because you're not going to have the patterns of life that the intellect can try to understand in day-to-day living. Whereas in a civilization, you have a complex culture where just by living, you're developing pattern recognition in that culture.
There's a certain Marxist professor we talked about that wrote that book, How the Irish Became White. Yeah, I think it was a Harvard professor.
Noel Ignatieff.
No, not yet.
Yeah.
And-
How the Italians became white.
Right.
Yeah.
So the same thing, like.
No, you can go back. You can go back to the 1870s and 80s, and you can see the Irish and the Italians being portrayed then in political cartoons, the way that you'll see immigrants being portrayed now in memes, like as animals, as monkeys, as mice. The kind of the subhuman. Well, Madison Grant, the great theorist, the great theorist of the United States, he said that the Irish and the Italians were subhuman. They weren't fully human.
But they got brought into the fold at a certain point.
Well, that's Ignatieff's point, is that
Where was the basis of that criticism, though? Because there are other cultures.
because they were monkeys.
Yeah, but there are some cultures that are better than others. Right?
Of course. I mean, of course, because there's different levels of. There's better education. There's better customs. The superior language. Superior culture. There's all sorts of factors that can create one culture being superior to another. The Yamu Mamu, if you go down there, all that they really know how to do, it seems like, is to eat you. I would say that's an inferior culture, right?
So I wouldn't want to live around people like that.
I mean, you wouldn't live that long around people like that. They'd have you for dinner.
Similar stuff going on in pagan, pre-Christian Ireland.
Right.
At one point,
You'd probably be tasty.
So I wouldn't say that the superior culture has to be a Christian culture, right?
Well, I think ultimately Christianity, because you have the Ten Commandments. They did this in the 1920s. Some of the missionaries did these surveys, going through all the different cultures in Asia and Africa, especially, and then the Indian tribes of Latin America, and every culture that they went to, it was never the same one or two commandments, but every culture they went to was living one or two of the commandments. So just the simple thing of the 10 commandments. Once you adopt all 10 of them, your culture flourishes in ways that it doesn't before. And when you don't have it, there's a huge gap. So just something as simple as that is very explanatory.
So what does Nick Fuentes say about white Catholicism? What is that?
Well, I think there's this whole movement. It's like, again, now we're kind of like, these are minority movements, but there's a movement, and I know the guy that started the podcast out in Idaho, of white Catholic nationalists. So there's a movement of people like, let's go to Idaho, and let's start white Catholic communities in Idaho, where we can exercise our superior culture.
Is that wrong to do that?
Yeah. because it's based on an error. It's based on an error of what it means to be human. It's taking something, and again, this is where the part that I gave you on nature basically says one of the fundamental errors of evolution is that you're taking something that's an accidental property of human nature, and you're taking the inferior and you're treating it as superior. It's a category mistake. And it'll always over time have bad moral consequences.
Like Hitler.
Well, that would be, I don't want to go there, but that would be an extreme, yes. Yeah. No, but obviously that's an extreme. That's one extreme. But but also at the same time, I wouldn't want to say that, well, because I'm a promoter of a healthy, patriotic nationalism, that doesn't make me Hitler. But what I just said, that we should cultivate a healthy, patriotic nationalism, that's going to lead a lot of people to say, well, you're being Hitler. Well, no, that's not the case.
Wouldn't like,
Right? That's why these distinctions are so important to make.
I hear Dr. Jones talk about the mestizo race, like in Mexico.
Yeah.
Calls it the cosmic race.
Right.
Where, due to Catholicism and a common culture, they were able to integrate and flourish into a nation.
Yes, but again, it takes. I think the point is, and this would be to Emmett's point, that it takes generations to do that.
Sure.
You can't say, so for example, what's been done in the last 5 years, we're going to bring in 20 million immigrants and expect overnight that there be immediate, but again, they're bringing them in weaponized ways, so it's complicated. But the normal process, when Aquinas was asked this question, right, should immigrants get full citizen status? Aquinas said it takes 3 generations for immigrants to assimilate. So they should only be given full citizen rights in the 3rd generation. Now, to your point, I would say that it does make sense that you, for the sake of, it does make sense for the sake of family harmony, and it would be understandable to say, I think it makes sense that I live close to a group of people that are like-minded.
Right.
Right? There's nothing wrong with that.
I just can't use.
But I would just say again, once you start saying we're going to have a white community, right? You're making a principle of distinction it's a false distinction.
Well, what if I said I just wanted an Irish community?
There are those.
Is it so? That's okay.
Yeah, because it's based on a nationality.
Okay.
Right, and nationalities have a right to the expression of their identity.
Okay.
Right.
That makes sense.
So with the theory of, or the process of 3 generations.
Yeah.
So, like you said, the large influx of immigrants, like for example, Dearborn, Michigan, or like Minnesota, with that amount of influx of Somali immigrants,
Right.
Does that happen in 3 generations? Because it seems like
Well, there have
brought their culture.
There have been so that's
taken over.
Yeah, that's the big question.
Yeah.
It's a big question because, well, there have been societies in the past that were set up where there was never integration. I come from the Polish side of my family. They lived in Lithuania for 500 years, and they never integrated. The Polish community in Vilnius never integrated into the Lithuanian culture. And in fact, that was probably, this is family lore, so I don't know the full, so the family lore is the reason that my family moved is that the Polish noble married a Lithuanian peasant. And so they had to leave the country. That was scandalous. It was so, actually, I thought it was great when I was in Lithuania. We were walking, this one high school Lithuanian boy was giving us a tour of Vilnius, the capital city there in Lithuania. And we're in the square in front of the church, in front of the cathedral. And all I see are white people. And little Vitas says, look around, look at, it was a summer night, there was, thousands of people it's a European square on a summer night, thousands of people there, right? He says, look around you. Look at the racial diversity we have in our city. I said, Vitas, what do you mean? He says, there's Latvians here, and Estonians, and Finnish, and Belarusians, and Russians, and Lithuanians, and Ruthenians, and he listed out about 6 other cultures. I said, well, Vitas, the typical American would just say that all I see is white people here. But that's where I think nationality is, like, it's okay to say, I'm an Irish American, like nationality means a lot.
Can I give a different example just for context?
Yeah,
Japan, Korea, China, India.
right.
Don't allow
Any.
anyone to be citizens in their countries.
Right.
Immigrants. You're an immigrant. You will always be an immigrant.
Yeah.
And they protect their culture really, really, really.
Legal. So
solidly.
I guess that's yeah. So that's the point, is that juridically there are juridical mechanisms that countries have to allow or not, historically, for the integration of immigrants. We've adopted a system. So even in the United States, before, when I looked into it, my understanding was from about 1820 until 1935, the juridical system that was set up in the United States was ethnic pluralism. That you're going to have these cities with ethnic neighborhoods, and you can have 5, 6, 7, 8, as many generations as you want of an ethnic group controlling its neighborhood. And that was Chicago until the 1930s. But in the 1930s, it was decided we're going to change that. We're going to break up the ethnic neighborhoods. So kind of what's interesting from this standpoint is it like the Somalis in Minnesota or the Somalis in Portland, Maine, right? That great southern Somalian climate. They're being treated kind of like the way the ethnic groups were treated before the Second World War in this country. You have your neighborhood and you can control it. And you don't have to assimilate.
Is that a good or bad thing?
Well, it's just two different juridical orders.
So when do you think?
Both could be just. I think in the case of the Irish, I think the difference would be that because of the common religion between like the Irish and the Italians and whatnot, assimilation between groups was much easier even in the previous order. That people could keep their neighborhoods, but because of the common religion, it made intermarriage easier. So it's one thing to say, oh, I'm an Irish Catholic and I'm going to marry a Polish Catholic. It's another thing to say, I'm an Irish Catholic and I'm going to marry a German Lutheran. You know, that's a much different
It
beast.
feels like that religion mix is happening a lot.
Oh, now more and more. Oh, yeah.
That's like-
Well, I would say again, there was a concerted effort in the 30s and 40s
Oh,
to undo the ethnic pluralism, to precisely try to have a more hodgepodge approach.
So when we say we're trying to preserve American culture, watching baseball and whatnot, I think we all kind of have an idea of what that is. When do you think that formed? Would that have been post this 30?
Well, I think I would argue that there's different iterations of what American culture, what is that?
We probably all agree with it, but we can't.
When we say the term American culture, right? This always happens in the history of language. When you say American culture, what are the concepts that fit under that?
Hot dogs.
Well, it changes over time,
What about the
right?
book?
And even hot dogs. Hot dogs is a creation of it's a propaganda creation, right? It's something that's been given to you, and we could study the moment where it entered in, but you can definitely say. So, for example, I taught a class on this once. In 1900, one concept that was directly under American culture was Protestant nation. America is a Protestant nation in 1900. By the time you get to 2000, when you say American culture, it's America is a Judeo-Christian nation. So there was a change. And that change, you can see Walter Lippmann. He wrote a book called Public Opinion. He was one of the first ones during the First World War who was put on a team to come up with what is American culture And what ideas do we want to put in people's minds to help them understand what American culture is? So he came up with the idea of the seventh inning stretch. And his idea leading up to the First World War and in the First World War was, what can you do during the seventh inning stretch to inculcate American culture into the people? So he writes about this in his book, Public Opinion. He says, the idea for Detroit was we had this like America pageant, and they would roll out into the field like a box. And the box had the Statue of Liberty on it. And then while they were singing whatever they sang, the seventh inning stretch, take me out to the ball game, these Polish guys would walk into the box wearing their Polish peasant clothes. And then they would walk out of the box on the other side in bowling uniforms. I mean, that was cheap. That was cheap propaganda. And you always, whenever you hear these examples from the past, you always say, oh, that's so obvious. But in the time, nobody understood it as that.
Fly F-16s
Right.
over the stadium.
Well, no, but now, yeah. So in our own time, different things. In our times, different things happen.
It works.
But it's the same idea. There's somebody there giving thought to what is American culture, and what are the ways we can inculcate that into the minds of people.
So that Muslims do not want that inculcation.
They do.
And
They
Mormons-
do. They do. Muslims do. Muslims all over this country are building the equivalent of YMCA's. And so on the one side you have the mosque, on the other side you have the basketball court and the gymnasium.
Are Jews doing that too?
Jews have always done that,
Well, I was going to
but
say,
they'll for themselves.
what about the idea by Herbert, the triple melting pot, Protestant, Catholic, Jew?
Yeah, I mean that's why I would say probably Muslims will be the fourth,
Okay.
and maybe also now Hindus, Indians.
Does that include like Sharia law, like in certain areas? Or?
I think like I know in Dearborn, Michigan, there's no Sharia law, but there are Muslim customs, so unwritten laws that everybody practices.
4 wives.
No,
I mean, they
no,
can't-
no, no.
Yeah, they can't.
No, I'm not talking. No. Much more simple. No, like just women don't go out on the streets on Friday afternoon in Dearborn, Michigan, because that's when the men are going to the mosque. It's just things like that. That's custom. That's unwritten law. Mormons will do the 4 wives thing out in Idaho and Utah, Nevada. You'll get little Mormon, not all the Mormons, little Mormon communities will try that kind of stuff.
I have a question about Mr. Fuentes, and why I think that he is so attractive, especially to the youth. I'm curious on your opinion
Yeah.
of this. But so, for example, when Bishop Barron interviewed Ben Shapiro, and Dr. Jones has talked about this before
Yeah.
too, and he has the opportunity to say, Ben, you need in order to experience salvation, you have to be
Yeah.
baptized. Or he had that opportunity to say
Right.
that, and he did not.
Right.
And then you get a guy like Fuentes, who obviously he's not clergy, but he is, he labels himself as a Catholic, a devout Catholic.
And by the way, there might have, I'm willing to admit, from the time he was 18 till now, there might be growth there.
Right. And I think that there is. I
Yeah.
think he's starting to
Yeah.
soften up his white nationalist
Yeah.
viewpoint. But
Yeah.
anyways, recently they were all over the internet because they were playing this Kanye West song, and they went to the club. I don't know if you saw any of this, and they were doing Roman salutes in the club, and everyone that was with Fuentes kind of capitulated after the media was going after them.
Right.
Everyone but Fuentes
Right.
apologized.
Okay.
And so that kind of like masculine, there's like a masculine energy there that is attractive. I mean, even I like it.
Yeah.
Where it's like, why are we apologizing to this media that is secular and hates Christianity? Why are we apologizing that? So when he doesn't do that, and then he'll take the position of, Ben, you need to be baptized. He'll say,
Yeah.
you need to be baptized.
Right.
So when we're not getting that from a person like Bishop Barron, which I would love to get that from him, but we're getting it from this guy who's like he's a media
Right.
commentator, but he
Right.
calls himself a Catholic.
Right.
So I'm curious, like, why aren't we seeing that from someone like Bishop Barron?
I think it's because, I would just say that I think a lot of Catholic intellectual leaders, I think many Catholic intellectual leaders, what they envision themselves, the person that they envision themselves in dialogue with is kind of the leftist progressive. And this goes back to the 1950s, and they're always trying to think of ways of, how can I say and do things that will appeal to the left-leaning progressive? And
Isn't that like a lukewarm position though? Like,
well, yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Yes, that if you like Dostoevsky's novel, Demons. The main character of the novel is Stepan Trofimovich. He's a left-leaning progressive. He's a left-leaning idealistic progressive, and he doesn't seem to get it. And he never figures it out in the course of the novel, that all of his children and all of his children's friends are all violent revolutionaries ready to burn everything down. And he always thinks, and even some of the characters in the novel, they think, well, I can at least speak with Stepan Trofimovich. He's an attractive guy and he's a gentleman. But the ideas that he holds are ideas that are going to lead to the destruction of the country. And Stepan Trofimovich doesn't seem to understand that. And so I think a lot of Catholic leaders, the way they envision themselves dialoguing with people, it's always as, I'm trying to bring the Stepan Trofimoviches of this world to Catholicism. And they seem to be naive on the one hand, that this is like one of the hardest people to bring to Catholicism. And then on the other hand, as you flirt with their ideas, you're opening the doors to everything going up in flames. Right? So I would agree that it's... Now on the other hand, I would say that there's this movement right now, which we have not discussed much yet, but it's running through the underground of young people in Washington, D.C., and it's in the circles of Nick Fuentes, which is the Bronze Age pervert, which is just, we got to go back, we got to follow Nietzsche, and we got to be strong men once again, and just go back to manly, masculine paganism.
But his thesis at Yale was called Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy.
Right.
So he's a eugenicist.
Right.
Castanal Murray was his
Right.
name. Yeah.
Right. So this is the other. So this is, in other words, this is where.
what does that mean though? Like,
Well, so this is what I'm saying. When you go into a dance club, and you're given the Roman salute, maybe are you also trying to go back? Are you also trying to mix in this mentality of the pre-Christian, anti-Christian masculinity? Right? And so there's also that symbolic element you got to be careful of. Right, so
read that book, The Bronze Age
Yeah.
Mindset. He's a pagan.
Yeah, he's a modern Nietzschean.
Yeah.
And these Bronze Age people, they look at people like the Catholic leadership and they say, yeah, these guys are not the answer, because they're not providing us with manly leadership. They're effeminate.
right. Brutal.
And so again, this is where I would come back to. There is a Christian manliness, but it's not pagan manliness. There's a difference.
So what does Christian manliness look like?
I would
Tell
say,
women not to vote anymore? Like,
well, I mean, you're free to take that position.
that is my position, but
yeah, you
I'm
know,
just saying, is that how it would look
right,
like?
right. But I mean, no. There's all. I think number one. I think part of Christian. Well, the Christian martyrs are the great example of Christian manliness.
Charlie Kirk.
Saying the truth. I don't know. Well, I'd be careful. Again, I think Charlie Kirk, you're going to have to make some distinctions. I would never propose him as a martyr. Not as a Christian martyr. No.
But I mean, manliness in a way.
There was something there, yes. But I think the Christian martyr, because you're willing to say the truth, you're willing to act on the truth, even if it costs you your reputation or your life. Like when I was at the university, the one thing that infuriated me is almost every practicing Catholic intellectual, when push came to shove, and he had a choice between sacrificing his reputation or standing up for the truth, and I'm talking about conservatives now, not like people who rebelled against one thing or the other. They would always choose reputation over the truth.
Or what about?
Or they would make a compromise. It always infuriated me. I'm like, this is your chance, man. And they would never do it.
Yeah.
They would always say, well, we got to compromise right now and wait for a future day. And that always, I mean, I think that's why I have stomach problems.
Yeah.
Right?
What about Alistair McIntyre as an example? He was a Marxist who ended up, I think, St. Thomas Aquinas' teachings converted him to Catholicism.
He came back to Catholicism, yeah.
That's a sense of...
Well, I used to have lunch with him.
Did you really? Yeah.
And I would joke with him, because he would always tell his students, you should always teach your classes in such a way that you're on the verge of getting fired. And when we would have lunch, I would say, you've never done that. When have you ever been close to getting fired for anything you've done in the classroom? I've had 6 meetings with the deans because of what I taught in the classroom, Alistair. Put up or shut up.
Is that Notre Dame?
Yeah. Yeah.
You used the term Judeo-Christian earlier.
Yeah.
Can you expound on that?
Judeo-Christianity was a term that was confected in the 1950s for political reasons.
Yeah.
To try to create an alliance among conservatives between Catholics, Jews, and evangelical Christians. So it's a political term.
Yeah.
That was created for political reasons.
So Mr. Fuentes went on a long rant about that, and he pretty much considered it a spit in the face of our Lord and his sacrifice.
Well, because, yeah, I mean, we are the true inheritors of the Jewish religion. The Catholic Church is the new Israel.
Right.
Right? So, and also modern Judaism, not the Torah,
Talmudic.
but modern Judaism defines itself against Christianity.
Right.
So to say that when they came up with this term in the 1950s, they were trying to come up with a term to sweep all the differences under the carpet for political reasons.
Right.
And this, if you do an engram on Google, so an engram is you just ask it to show you how, in whatever books Google has access to, how often that term is being used.
Right.
You'll see it skyrockets in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And then it slowly trickles down.
Okay.
Is it
To our
true
own
that
time.
If you get baptized into the Catholic Church and you were Jewish as a convert, you lose your Israeli citizenship?
Yeah.
It doesn't sound very Judeo-Christian.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Cool. We've been going for about an hour and a half.
Okay.
Is that enough? I mean, I think we could break up and
We could. There's food.
there's
and
food, and we
drinks.
can have just private, individual
There's a
conversations.
Email list, sign up for future get-togethers, and there's a Venmo if you want to donate anything for food and drinks for future get-togethers. It's all on the table there.
So I think the idea is, number one, that, well, for food and drink, if people want to contribute for that, and then also, I think for future get-togethers, I have a number of people in different parts of the country that are interested in listening in or seeing what we do here. And so we're also looking into getting all the basic equipment that we might need in order to be able to spread this far and wide, or have people zoom in and join us as when we do it live.
Absolutely.
So any money beyond the food and drink money would also be used for those purposes.
Hey, Bob, could you remind everyone what the name of the channel is and where that comes
So my channel, I have my channel on YouTube, on Rumble, and on Locals, and on Spotify, It's called Powers and Principalities. Our battle is one with powers and principalities. It's a biblical. It's biblical, but it might not seem that way. But yeah, so it's a YouTube channel. It's on Rumble, Locals, and Spotify. Powers and Principalities. That's where we're going to put my talk. And I have other stuff. Like I have on that channel already some lectures that I gave in political philosophy and other talks that I've given over time in various places.
And then any idea of future talks that are in the works or being developed?
So,
Or themes?
yeah, so I again, for these monthly things or once every 6 week things that we're doing, Seamus and I talk and we try to come up with, like, based on what we've done, what might be interesting to do next. So that's kind of, but I'm also looking into maybe doing a course, maybe an introduction to political philosophy course, or Seamus and I were talking about this actually, maybe doing the course that I did at Notre Dame. And in 1900, America was Protestant nation. In the year 2000, it was Judeo-Christian. How did that change happen? And where are we going next? That's kind of an interpretation of American history type course. But we might do something. That's another possibility. Classes like that. In other words, classes that, so the idea of if I do a class, it will be, what did I teach when I was a professor that I could just very, very easily do again? And sometimes the second time you do it is a lot better than the first time you do it.
Without the price tag.
And then, yeah, no, but then the idea is that I would just do I would like, if we do these courses, let's say I would do a class every other Monday. And I would do it live at, let's say, 4 in the afternoon. But then it would be recorded and a person could watch it at any time.
That'd be awesome.
But if someone wanted to or could be there live, they could also do that too.
Awesome.
We can definitely figure out a way
Cool.
to live stream
Yeah.
next time.
Yeah. Good.
You guys
Thank
have
you.
do you have an email that goes
Awesome.
around?
Well, great work.